All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. I am going to be covering the leftover material from this past Wednesday night's class, which is we left off with some of chapter 10. The leftover material from last time is on tonight's worksheet. So if you have tonight's, that's all you need. You're good there. But I want to start off with a discussion question that will be somewhat related to chapter 12. So if you want to scan through the opening verses of chapter 12, you can do that. And this was something I just want us to start here and then come back to it in a later part of our class. What would you say, and this is obviously open to interpretation and your experience and your choice of words here. I don't know why I felt like I needed to say that, but I did. What would you say is the typical Western civilization, being America and her, closely related cultural nations? What is the typical Western civilization take on old age?
Horrible and should be avoided at any cost.
I'm sorry, what?
It's horrible and should be avoided at any cost.
Okay, in some ways, that's the way it seems. Somebody over here is also saying, yes, but it can be wonderful. So that's a bit of it as well. Okay.
And you're right. It is a cultural thing. If we were to go to the Orient, they're revered.
Yeah. Yeah. Revered to the point where if you laugh at it the way that Americans do, you seem extremely disrespectful.
Yes.
Right? It's one of the most disrespectful ways you could behave towards somebody in your culture, is to laugh at their age. Okay, especially if they are aged. All right, other ways of expressing it? What the typical American perspective on this is? We do tend to poke fun at it, right? Right, and the closer each of us gets to it, the more we tend to do that, because it's like this bad thing, like Ashley said, it's like this bad thing that we're trying to keep it at bay, so if we can laugh at it, it's like it doesn't have power over us anymore. It's like holding it at arm's length psychologically, okay? So that's an interesting one. Emily?
I think, thinking about Ashley, aging, right? We don't love that part of it. But I also think as far as wisdom and tradition, a lot of, I think, Western culture is all about enlightenment and the new way of doing things. And so the old way, the traditional way, is not always revered or sought out.
Yes. Okay. So Emily's opening the door for us to ask the flip side of the coin here, the flip side of that question, which is, what is the biblical take on, by the way, if anybody knows which knobs and switches to push and turn for this thing, go for it, because it's a little messed up. But what is the biblical take on aging, and especially on old age? We kind of heard the Eastern one. Gary referenced that. We live inside the Western one, so we know that. What's the biblical one? Is it anywhere between, or is it like one of those? What do you think?
To me, it is, I'll call it more Eastern versus the American way.
Okay. All right. Other perspectives on it?
Getting older, so you're getting closer to death. People are afraid of death. That's the stigma, I think.
Yeah.
In our culture.
Yeah.
But when you're a Christian and you're obeying God and you know what's awaiting you, you're not really afraid of that. You're just closer to a different beginning.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I've forgotten which one of Paul's epistles he talks about it, but he does talk about those who through the fear of death were held captive to an idea, and he says that is not the Christian way of thinking. So
Because fear, so this is control.
Yep.
That's afraid to do it.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like Ray's opening up a whole new vein of thought that we could go with in this discussion. But he's right. He's exactly right on the money. We have this fear of death that makes old age seem like this thing we should get rid of. But the Christian perspective is, you are getting closer to the way that Paul talked about. For me to die and be with Christ is gain. Right? So it zaps that power away from being aged, So it's interesting. So I think Gary's point is well taken. He said it's closer, the biblical version is closer to the Eastern version. Okay. I think the Eastern version is a little bit out of kilter, right? Because it's too I don't know, it's too serious in some ways. The Bible would have us be joyful and have some levity about some things. Okay, and so that's built in. But it's much closer to that way of thinking, and the reason is because of the hope we have in Jesus. Now, all that is kind of priming our minds for us to get to the end of chapter, or to the beginning of chapter 12, because tonight one of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of vapor is that youth is vapor, and that life is heading in one direction because time is heading in one unstoppable direction. Okay, and so that's one of the things that we're going to get around to. But I just kind of wanted to prime our minds to think about how different the biblical perspective on old age and death really is than the way that our culture would have us think. And so it's going to be a paradigm shift, and we need to make sure that we let it be that, because sometimes we don't realize we have two ideas that are contradictory to one another because we haven't really analyzed the other one. But hopefully we can do that a little bit better now that we've looked into this to start us off tonight. Okay, we're going to start in chapter 10 of Ecclesiastes, and we're going to work our way through a little bit of the leftover material from last time, and then I will make sure that I finish on time tonight because this is the end of the book. We kind of have to. So, Nikki's going to lead us in a word of prayer, and then we'll get going with the new material for this evening.
Shall we? Holy Father, we're so thankful to you for the blessings that you give us. We're thankful for the privilege that we have of calling upon you as our Father, expressing our heart's desire unto you, making our supplication for those round about us who have needs. Pray thy richest blessings would be upon us tonight as we study from this grand book. Help us to glean the things that will help us to focus our lives on serving you, being faithful unto the end, that we might have that home with you in heaven. Guide our lives always. Help us to have an appreciation of the things that you have to say to us. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, so last time we talked through chapters 8 and 9 and part of 10 about the different things in life that work against us. And so here's the review of the first 4 sections. From chapter 8, verses 1 through 9, human power works against us. The next handful of verses after that, when we speculate about God and what he's up to and what he's thinking beyond what he has actually said of himself, that tends to work against us. It is not helpful to do that sort of thing. Almost never is it helpful. We also looked at how the same event happens to them all, and that would be how death works against us. Okay, and then in the section following that, we looked at how often our expectations or predictions about the world, they tend to work against us because all is vapor, as Solomon says, and so these things are just impossible to predict. Now that gets us to chapter 9, starting in verse 18, all the way through chapter 10, verse 7. And this is a poem that, number one, it just has some interesting choices of words in it, interesting metaphors. So like starting in chapter 10, verse 1, dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, and so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart inclines him to the left. Even when a fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. The point of this section is that foolishness works against us. Now, other places in the book, he said that wisdom helps us. It's not perfect, and it's still vapor, but it does help. Here, flip side of that coin, is that foolishness works against us. And so foolishness can so easily ruin many good things. You put one fool surrounded by a bunch of incredibly wise people in the highest positions of power in a country, and a lot of things can go wrong for a lot of people. Dead flies can ruin the perfumer's ointment, and so one fool can make all kinds of bad things happen around him, no matter how much wisdom is there. Now, I also really love this section, and I think this is important to read. Let's see. What am I looking for exactly? Okay, verses 5, 6, and 7. 5, 6, and 7, there is an evil that I have seen under the sun, as it were an error proceeding from the ruler, that folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses and princes walking on the ground like slaves. His point is that foolishness and wisdom are often not found where we would expect them to be. Which, of course, that's no surprise, but this laid into the book of Ecclesiastes. If we've taken the time to ponder everything else that he said, we're like, yeah, of course. I mean, that's the unpredictability of this world, of living under the sun. That you watch an entourage of royalty going past, and you think, well, obviously the man sitting on the horse and being escorted by all these people, he's got to be the wisest and therefore most important person in this group. But the wisest person in the group may be the slave who is at the end scooping behind the horse. And yet he's there in the lowliest place. The point is, you can't always tell. You just can't judge a book by its cover. And so you have to just make sure that you understand this is the unpredictable vapor world that we live in. Okay. Now, all these things that have worked against us, here's the last one in chapter 10, and that is that the simplest things in life tend to work against us sometimes. I think this section is really fascinating, and I wish we had the time to just read it out loud. But the common denominator, I think, between all these different things that he's talking about at the end of chapter 10 is that all of these things are things that can injure and hinder and confuse human efforts. All these different things that he's talking about. And so he who digs a pit will fall into it. Verse 9, he who quarries a stone is hurt by it. Verse 12, the lips of a fool consume him. Okay? And so he's just going to go through and he's going to enumerate all these different things that can become a problem for humanity. And they are the simplest sounding things, like, for instance, falling. Falling down. It's not that big a deal, right? It's not when you're a toddler. Pretty much any time after that, it starts to matter a lot. You're like, it's so simple. It seems so powerless over us. But he who builds a wall or is breaking one down, you're going to fall and hurt yourself. And it could be actually kind of serious. And we've all had experiences or seen or heard stories about that sort of thing, where it's the simplest thing that became a huge life problem for somebody. Garden variety animals, same sort of deal. Listen, there's probably snakes in all of our gardens. We don't see them as often. I'm not sure why that is, but they're probably there all around us. I know this because I was sitting at my kid's piano lesson not too long ago, and a 10-point buck walked out of the lady's garden next door to the piano teacher's house. Like, how is that just hiding here in plain sight in a neighborhood? And if a big one is doing that, then these little garden snakes, they can become big problems, right? That's what he's talking about here, that a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall, verse 8. Okay, sticks and stones. We actually use that phrase to talk about things that won't hurt us, but they will. People that are splitting wood, they get hurt in serious ways in the process of splitting sticks. And you can make it sound that simple because it is that simple, but it still sometimes ends up having power over us. And then all these others are talked about through the rest of this chapter. Things as simple as overeating. And making a habit of overeating. I mean, that's one of the sins that we never talk about in the Bible because everybody starts to feel guilty. I get that. We should. Okay, that's the right response to that. It's such a simple sounding thing, but Solomon is telling us, and Paul would tell us in 1 Corinthians 6, that even that can have power over you. Even that can ruin things about your life if you're not paying attention. Because as powerful as humans are, as much as we think we have things figured out, as much as we look at a list like this and we think those things are way too simple that they could ever ruin anything that I'm in control of, good luck being in control of that, because it's all vapor. These things still somehow have the potential to do damage to us because our lives are vapor that we just don't control entirely. And so that's the key point and the key takeaway from the rest of chapter 10. Any thoughts, questions, arguments, disagreements on that? On chapter 10? Okay. All right, perfect. So let's get into chapter 11. And getting into chapter 11, we're really getting close to the end here. We've only got these 2 short chapters left. In the Pew Bibles, it pretty much just covers one page, which is not even a full page. So there's not a huge amount of writing left, but there's still so much depth in this as you would probably expect. So can I get a volunteer to start in chapter 11 and read for us the first 6 verses? Who wants to read? Raise a hand, let me know. Derek, thank you much. Appreciate it.
All right, chapter 11, 1 through 6. Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7 and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth. And if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. He who observes the wind will not sow. He who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is a child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand. For you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, and whether both alike will be good.
Okay, thank you, sir. What does it mean? What does this section mean? Scott, what you got?
Life is an adventure, but live it by faith.
Okay, that is a really good way to say that. Life is an adventure, which means there's a lot of unpredictability. So live it by faith. Yeah, it's a great way to summarize that. Anybody else want to take a stab at it? Derek.
It makes me think of, I think I'll talk about myself in this. When I was younger, I thought in certain ways of life that if I just do these things in this order, this is going to be the result. If I follow these steps, this is where I'm going to be in my career or whatever it might be, right? And what you find in life is that's not the case. Like I said, life's an adventure.
Yep.
But it doesn't mean to stop trying to do good, right?
Yes.
Don't just give up because of that, because the result doesn't come when you think it's supposed to.
Yes, absolutely. Really great way to distill that, and to put it in terms of the daily way that we live our lives, because that's exactly the point that Solomon is making here. Okay, put both of those together, and I think you have the core essence of what he's talking about here. What he's telling you in these verses is keep your life moving forward. Keep doing good in your life. You don't know how that's all going to pan out. You never fully know how that's going to work out. So what you do is you move forward anyway, trusting that God will be there and will give you what is the best thing to give you. You continue to go forward, okay? And so he gives a couple of examples here. The first one is investing. That is the very definition of investing when you think about it. That you don't really know how this is going to go. Now, you think you do, and so you pick low-risk investments, but there's a reason they call them low-risk and not no-risk investments, because there's no such thing as a no-risk investment. Low is good. We want that, okay? But even that is just opening us up to the fact that there is still some unpredictability in the world. And that's what he's talking about here. So when he says, cast your bread upon the waters, and in many days it will come back to you, some of the different translations and some of the ways that you can approach this is actually talking about more about grain than about bread. Because I don't know about anybody else, but I picture like a baguette being put on top of the surface of a water and it just like getting soggy until it sinks. I'm like, this doesn't really translate for me. But he's talking about grain. Okay, that's another way you can translate it. And so when you think about that, it's the idea of you ship this away to somewhere and you expect, I shipped it off, and at some point these sailors are going to come back and they're going to bring me the profits from what I produced on my farm and I shipped away and sold to these other people. Now, for us, like we do money transfers instantly, but for them, that's how business was done. You send the ship off loaded with grain and you just hope months later, those honest sailors are going to come back and they're going to pay you your profits. You have to have some faith. You have to believe in something that you can't control or see or perfectly predict happening in the future in order to go into that venture. Okay? And that's the same idea here when he talks about it in verse 2 about giving a portion of that to 7 or 8 different people. I think he's talking about the way that we diversify a portfolio. Why do we do that? Well, we do that to sort of prevent the effects of vapor, right? Because what can happen when it's all in one place? You can lose it all in an instant. Now, when it's diversified in 7 or 8 places, you can still lose it all in an instant. Job is a good example of that. But it's less likely because that's just not how the world tends to work. And so there's a few ways that you can prevent that. But again, he's saying these two big ideas with the background knowledge that the world is full of things that are vapor. That this is not perfectly predictable. And so I actually really like the way that the New Living Translation puts these two verses. I find this to be really, really helpful here. He says, send your grain across the seas, and in time profits will flow back to you. But divide your investments among many places, for you do not know what risks might lie ahead. Now, basically what they're doing in the New Living Translation is they're going ahead and giving us what they think it means and what Solomon intended to get across to us. It's not literal at all. The ESV is translating it literally, and whatever version Derek read from is the same, okay? But this, I think, is probably a helpful way to explain the meaning in this particular case. All right, Gary, you had a comment. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was thinking of the one talent guy.
Yeah. Yep.
No risk.
Right. Which was a much bigger risk, as it turns out. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great connection here. Now, keep going, and verses 3 and 4, it seems like he's completely gone off his rocker, and he's talking about something totally different with like trees, land, staying where they fall and all that sort of thing. But I think here's the point that he means for us to learn from that. The natural world does what it will, but don't let that stop us from doing what we should. Okay? And I think that's his point at the end of verse 4, that he who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. You stand there and you look at the skies churning above your farm, and you go, oh man, I'm just not sure. I better wait till I'm sure before I do anything about this farming business. You do that in the spring, you're not going to have anything in the fall, right? And so his point is, you go ahead and do what you're supposed to do. Things are going to happen. Trees are going to fall. And when they fall, they're just going to land where they land. Whether it's pointing north or south, they're going to land where they land. But you do what you're supposed to with the time and the resources that you have in your life. It's like Jesus said, night is coming when no man can work. But while it is day, I've got stuff to be doing. That's what he told the disciples. And it's the same principle for us. We have to continue to do what we will do, even knowing, or doing what we should do, even knowing that the world is vapor. And so here it is again, same concept in verses 5 and 6. The things that we don't know should not be allowed to cripple our efforts in the world. We have to choose to trust God and do good. Okay? And that, I think, is the key to this whole section. In the morning, sow your seed, and at evening withhold not your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, whether this thing or that thing, or whether both alike will be good. You don't know. But you won't get anything out of it if you don't do something with what you have now. And that's his point. Don't let the possibilities of all the vapor things in life stop you from being the person that you should be right now. It's actually, this is just now occurring to me, and no surprise here, that the wisdom literature would connect to James. But does anybody remember what James said about the one who knows to do good and doesn't do it? It's a sin, yeah. And I think there's, number one, there's a principle of holiness and righteousness built into that just by the use of the word sin. There's very serious examples where if you know to do good and you don't, that's a sin, an all-out evil thing, okay? But there are also plenty of examples where it's a little less serious. It maybe wouldn't be called a sin, but it's for sure foolish to know what is the good thing to do and just choose not to do it. To look at the sky and go, I can't really tell what's about to happen. I better not do anything yet. No, go ahead and do something. Do what you're supposed to. Don't look at the sky and say, I'm not going to plant in the spring. You've got to plant in the spring, whether it's going to be good weather or bad. You've got to diversify your portfolio because you can lose everything on one bad venture. And again, it's vapor, so you can still lose a diversified portfolio on a bad venture too. But it's at least a little bit more sure if we trust God and keep moving forward in life. Good? Does that make sense in that section? Okay.
Also taking care of others by sharing it with others.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And listen, how much biblical principles of economics is wound up in what Ray just said right there? Is so much about what the Bible teaches us about money and wealth of any different kind is about that one thing right there. Are you taking care of other people? Okay? And so if you do what you're supposed to do, it gives you an opportunity to continue to do more of what you're supposed to do, which helps other people. Any other thoughts on that first section of chapter 11? All right, good. It gives us a little bit more time to enjoy this next section about the vapor of youth. Enjoy ? I'm not sure if that's how this is going to go. Starting in chapter 11, verse 7, and all the way through chapter 12, verse 8, really through 12:7. This is the section that Ecclesiastes talks about the vapor of youth. And this is a section that I think is kind of funny. This is why I started with the questions that I did tonight. It's kind of funny in some ways, but it's also really, really serious. And I'll show you why I think that here in just a few minutes, okay? So let's just start at the end of chapter 11, starting in verse 7. And can I get a volunteer to read 7, 8, and, well, just 7 to the end of the chapter? 7, 8, 9, and 10. Sean, you were the first one I saw. Thank you, sir.
Light is sweet, and it is pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. So if a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart and the sight of your eyes. But know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. Remove vexation from your heart and put away pain from your body, for youth and the dawn of life are bad.
Okay, so what's his admonition and the way that we're supposed to think about youth? Just in those verses, what's his admonition?
You're going to come into judgment.
Okay, all right, for sure. I mean, he says it as much. He says as much in those verses. Flesh it out a little bit more. Because you're going to come into judgment, what's his perspective on what you should do?
Enjoy it, but do it wisely.
Yes, exactly, right? It's interesting to me. His main point here is enjoy it. And it's interesting that he says, now don't forget, there will be a judgment day, okay? But it's not as though he highlights any sins in this section that he says, now enjoy it, but don't do this sin and this sin and this sin and this sin. His point is, when you're young and you have things to enjoy them. Obviously with some wisdom. That's what he's been talking about all the way through, and he's the same guy that wrote Proverbs. So we know he means for us to be wise at all times in our lives. However, his point is, enjoy what God has given you. And I think that's really wonderful. By the way, this is one of the repeated refrains all the way through Ecclesiastes. That he says, here's these gifts that you have from God. When you have them, enjoy them. Why? Because they are gifts from God. Now, this is the very last one of those that he will talk about in this book. And so it's really cool to me. I think it's probably some significance, and I haven't really explored what that significance is, but I think there's probably some significance about the fact that he saved this particular one for last. Enjoy youth. He has said in other places, enjoy a good feast day. Enjoy time with your family. Enjoy the relationship in your youth with your wife and all these different things. But now he says, just enjoy youth because it is a gift from God while you have it. So, along with that, the repeated refrain is, remember God in that process and in that time of your life. So he tells us to know 3 things in this section. He says, know that God is the one who will judge our lives, whether for good or for bad. He says, know God while your life for the most part is good. Okay? And know that there will be a time when life under the sun ends, and God will be there at the end. Okay? So it is in some ways kind of this looming truth, right? It's the one event happens to everybody. Live your life knowing that you will die. That's very psychologically healthy. I know it's not happy, but it's very psychologically healthy to live your life that way. And along with knowing that you will die, which is chapter 9's point, know that God is there while you live, and he will be there when you die. Both of those are very psychologically healthy realizations. Actually, they are imperative realizations for the Christian worldview. You have to learn to think that way if you're going to be the Christian, the person that you should be. And so this whole idea of remembering God, this is the dose of sobriety that we need for those who are youthful and tend to follow youthful passions. Okay? Because it just helps us to keep our minds centered and to keep our view on what's most important beyond life under the sun. Okay? Now that gets us into chapter 12. And for me, this is just my take on chapter 12 and my experience with it. I've heard verse 1 an awful lot. And then I've heard the rest of it read and sort of chuckled at a good bit, and that's about it. Anybody else? This is the way that it's been treated around you? Okay, well, if it's not, I'm kind of glad for that. I don't think it's the best way to treat this. I don't think that's the right emotional approach to this, okay? Verse 1 is obviously extremely important as a reminder for teenagers, which is when I heard it the most. But the rest of it is this very sobering reality of the fact that life, time, takes its toll. Okay? And so he's going to frame his whole description of what happens to us and what becomes part of our lives in old age and in later years, twilight years, or whatever phrase is most politically correct for you. You pick. But he's going to frame his whole description of what happens to us on that end of life in terms of an estate that is gradually becoming run down. It's an interesting way to frame it. Now, you have to think like estate, okay? You can't just think like small cottage here with just the tiniest little yard around it. We have to think like a grand estate, a big old house, servants' quarters and other places, the grounds that are immaculately kept and all this, and the place is just full of life, and it's all cultivated and cared for, and all of that is really good, but that's what it used to be. And now it's this picture of an estate that's starting to run down. And where it used to be producing all the stuff that they needed right there on the same estate, a lot less is coming out of the farm work that's being done. And the management of things is not quite as, quite as up to speed as it used to be. And the buildings themselves are starting to run down. That's the kind of picture that he's painting when he starts to use all these different poetic phrases. Now, again, this breaks the mold of how Americans tend to think about it, because we tend to think like greeting card stuff, right? This is the way that we handle old age, is we make jokes about it. Your chariot awaits. Today's your day. Smile while you still have teeth. And if you can read the last words on this birthday card, then you are not that old, highlighted yet. Okay. This is the way we tend to treat old age. And again, I think part of this is kind of what you're talking about at the beginning of class. We want to hold death as far away from us as possible because we fear it. And so anything that shows us we're advancing toward that, we want to chuckle at that so that it seems not to have psychological power over us. But Ecclesiastes is going to say, no, listen, this is what it really looks like. So here you go. Are you ready? Let's face the facts. Remember your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come, and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house tremble and the strong men are bent and the grinders cease because they are few and those who look through the windows are dimmed and the doors on the street are shut, and when the sound of the grinding is low and one rises at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of song are brought low, they are afraid also of what is high and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners will go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern, and the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to the God who gave it. Time takes its toll. And all these pictures of the estate going downhill. Number one, this is really wonderful poetry. But number two, it's also not Solomon's way of handling it like an American. He is not chuckling at the fact that the grinders cease because they are few, as though that was like this kind of funny, punny way that he could say your teeth are starting to fall out. Solomon is talking about the fact when the grinders cease because they are few, it's on an estate. What that means is you're not making enough grain anymore, enough flour anymore to have bread for the whole estate. You're not producing anymore. You're not up to the speed that you used to be. Okay? And so none of this is a clever pun. All of this, when you put it in terms of that estate that's starting to run down, especially if you can think in Solomon's time, think of Solomon's entire palace staff. And yet in some way, because the king is getting old, the palace is not running like it should anymore. And that's the image that he's using to describe all of this. And so the different things that he's talking about is that many pleasures are starting to lose their appeal. You get old enough, they just don't sound as good as they did when you were young. There is a pall over some aspects of life that just keeps coming back. There are plenty of biographers that think that Winston Churchill suffered with some serious depression, like lifetime serious depression, and he always referred to it as the black dog that kept coming back to him at the worst times. What Solomon calls it right here is storm clouds that come back after it rains. Like, wait a minute, it just rained. The clouds should blow away and the sun should come out. And he says, no, sometimes the clouds just come right back. And it's ready for another rainstorm. He talks about fear overtaking courage so that the strong men are bent and those who are supposed to be on watch they're not able to do it anymore. They don't have the constitution for it anymore. Productivity and sensitivity just slow or stop. I find this one really compelling because I'm a musician, but he says the joy of music becomes the burden of noise. You know, it's just interesting and kind of sad. Verse 4, when the sound of the grinding is low, one rises at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. It's not helpful. It's not fun anymore. The color, energy, and desire all fail their past brightness. Life, for sure, we start to sense in a new kind of way that it has a definite end. And even if life is wonderful and beautiful and artfully done, like a silver bowl or, like a gold chalice or some precious piece of dinnerware, even that returns to the dust. It turns into dust. Those are the realities, And like I say, there's nothing clever or punny about this. This is his very stark description of what it's like facing the end of life. And what is his point in doing that when it's been all the way through the way that he's talked about vapor? What is his point in saying that? His point is that life itself and the whole cycle of life, you get to the end of it and you start to look back, and that's the moment when you really take it seriously that you go, none of that was wasted, but it was always a vapor because I couldn't hold on to it. It's really fascinating. By the way, the one that really strikes me the most and that I've learned the most about in studying for this class is verse 5. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails. That's what the ESV says. Does anybody else say something different for that third one right there? Does anybody else say something other than desire fails? What is it? The caperberry is ineffective. Okay, that is the literal translation of that. Okay, would you like to know what a caperberry is? It's an aphrodisiac. It's meant to excite sexual pleasure. Interesting. So what we have is these three metaphors where he says the almond tree blossoms. Guess what color an almond tree's blossoms are? They're white. Sorry, y'all, that white hair. Okay, that's what he's talking about. The grasshopper drags itself along. That is gotta be the most spry creature in the animal kingdom. That thing can bounce anywhere. It is so light on its feet, but it's dragging itself along. And even an aphrodisiac is not going to do it anymore. It's just not getting us to where it used to be. No wonder the other translations make it more palatable when they say desire fails. That's what they mean. But it's an interesting turn of phrase in the Hebrew. That he is just like putting it right in your face. You take the strongest thing you got that you can think of, and it at some point it's not doing it anymore. And so all of this is again just pointing to the fact that all these things are vapor. And so Solomon's first words and his final ones, probably at least possibly his final ones in the book, totally match. There are some who think that a later author added everything from verse 9 to verse 14, that Solomon finished with these words in chapter 12 and verse 8, these very familiar sounding words, vapor of vapors, says the preacher, all is vapor. Verse 1 of this book says the words of the preacher. Then his first words are these. And if you stop the book right here, it would be a fitting place for that same author to finish things up after he has said, you go all the way through your life, and this is the way that it looks looking back. It's depressing, isn't it? I'll be honest about it, but it's so beautifully done, just really fascinating. Okay, here's the epilogue then, verses 9 through 14. Again, this may have been added later by another divinely inspired author, but here's what it's about. Solomon's gifts were a gift to his own people and to anybody else who will listen and truly take them to heart. Verses 11 and 12 are an appeal for people to listen to these words, and he's not just giving us an all-out command, but he's strongly encouraging us, if you're going to listen to a lot of philosophy, make sure this is at the top of the pile. Pay attention to this kind of philosophy, because this is what you need to know. This is the real answer to so many of life's biggest questions. And then the conclusion of all of it is the words that we know so well, which kind of express resignation and acceptance and fulfillment all at the same time. Okay, because the end of all of this is there is one thing that is not vapor. The one thing that is not vapor of vapors is fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. It sounds very much like the way that Jesus finished his most important writing, his most important speech anyway. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like what kind of man? A wise man who didn't build his house on something that moves and shifts and is just vapor. He built his house on the rock, and it did not fall. Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. And that's the vapor, and that's the solid foundation that Solomon is getting us to, going all the way through all of his musings and everything at the end of it. Okay, so can I finish with a quote from one of the commentaries that I've really been helped by in this whole study? And then I'll leave it open with however much time we have left. But here's the quote. Ecclesiastes is a book of life. It is bright precisely in its dazzling darkness. It is a book of life precisely because it honestly and nakedly confronts the fact of death. It is a great, great book because it explores deeply and uncompromisingly a great, great question: what are our lives under the sun for? And the answer, despite everything else that you might think and try and experiment with, is that our lives are to fear God and keep his commandments. That's the whole of man. It's really a remarkable piece of writing. All right. Any thoughts, questions, or reflections on everything we've been through with this book? Nobody? Miss Molly, what do you got?
You just made a comment a while ago and said, it's pretty sad, isn't it? But as I've gotten older, it's not sad. It's reality. And it's just not sad.
Good. Good. I think Solomon would be so happy to hear you say that. I really do. I'm glad it doesn't feel like that. I guess I just feel that way because I've been trained to feel that way. You know what I mean?
But I'm telling you, as we're getting older, it's great.
Well, good. Let's all do it. Sounds good to me. Yes, sir, Mr. Mickey.
Just a brief comment. All of what Solomon has to say with all of it's monotonous. And even the few passing pleasures that he does mention that we have in this life, all of it is fleeting and passing. And what reward we get it for in a while. Mm-hmm. But he's describing in all of the book, except these last few verses, life without God.
Mm-hmm. Under the sun.
And Miss Molly pointed out the difference. Yep. Here's life with God.
Yeah, absolutely. Which again, back to Ray's first comment tonight. The gospel changes our view of the end of life. And it doesn't change these realities, because this is life under the sun, but it changes how they impact us. And yeah, absolutely. Great way to finish it up. Thanks for all your insights and comments on this. For next week, I did not put any homework questions in there, but please make the time to read from Proverbs, the first 2 chapters. Okay, that'll be what we're talking about next time is Proverbs chapters 1 and 2. And then we'll just spend a couple weeks on Proverbs and a couple weeks on the Song of Solomon, which will be fun. Okay? All right, there you go. Thank you.